The late train, a reading on that fog-shrouded February evening, carried more than its usual complement of mysteries, though neither Hercule Poirot nor I suspected this as we settled into our first-class compartment. The Belgian detective adjusted his overcoat with characteristic precision, his eagle eyes surveying our fellow passengers with the sort of methodical attention he typically reserved for crime scenes. "Mais non, Hastings," he murmured, his accent lending gravity to his observations. "Observe how the human drama unfolds even in so mundane a setting as a railway carriage. Each passenger, they carry their secrets like so much luggage, some light, some heavy, all carefully concealed." I followed his gaze toward the platform, where the last stragglers hurried through the swirling mist. Among them, a young woman caught my attention, not for her beauty, though she possessed a striking quality that transcended mere prettiness, but for the air of desperate determination that seemed to emanate from her very posture. She stood beneath one of the flickering gas lamps, clutching a worn leather valise, her fair hair dampened by the evening's moisture. What struck me most forcefully was her expression of absolute resolve, as though she had steeled herself for some tremendous ordeal. Her blue eyes held a quality I'd seen before in the faces of those who had suffered great loss, a mixture of pain and unwavering purpose that spoke of battles fought in solitude. "Tiens," Poirot observed quietly, "there is one who travels not toward something pleasant, but away from something unbearable. See how she clutches that valise, not as one who packs for a holiday, but as one who flees." A tall gentleman in a dark overcoat approached her with evident urgency. His movements betrayed both authority and deep concern, and when he spoke, his voice carried the cultivated tones of the English upper classes, though strained with emotion. "Claire, I implore you to reconsider," he said, his words carrying clearly in the crisp night air. "You cannot simply return to High Gables after all these years and expect—" "I expect nothing, Uncle Henry," the young woman replied, her voice steady despite the tremor I detected beneath its surface. "Accept the truth. After 10 years of silence, I deserve that much." Poirot's eyes sharpened with interest. "High Gables," he repeated softly, and I saw recognition flicker across his features. "Most curious, Hastings. That is precisely our destination." The gentleman, Uncle Henry, continued his appeal with growing desperation. "The past is buried for good reason, my dear. Some stones are better left unturned. Your mother's death was thoroughly investigated. The coroner's verdict—" "The coroner's verdict was wrong," Claire interrupted, her composure cracking slightly. "I was there, Uncle Henry. I saw what happened. I was 12 years old, not blind. Someone pushed her from that terrace, and I intend to prove it." The train's whistle shrieked through the night, and Claire seized the moment to board, leaving her uncle standing helplessly on the platform. She entered our compartment with quick, determined steps, settling herself across from us with the air of one who had crossed a Rubicon. Poirot rose with courtly grace, removing his hat in a gesture of old-world courtesy. "Mademoiselle, permit me to introduce myself. I am Hercule Poirot, and this is my friend Captain Hastings. We could not help but overhear. You are traveling to High Gables?" Her eyes widened with recognition. "The detective? Yes, I've read of your cases in the newspapers. How extraordinary." She paused, studying his face with new interest. "Yes, I'm going to High Gables. My name is Claire Renfrew." "Ah." Poirot settled back into his seat, his grey cells clearly already at work. "Then we are fellow travelers in more ways than one, Mademoiselle Renfrew. We too have business at High Gables. Sir Alister has summoned me regarding a matter of some urgency." Claire's composure finally cracked entirely. "Uncle Alister sent for you, but why? What's happened?" "He wrote of feeling threatened," Poirot explained gently, "and of certain revelations he felt compelled to make. Perhaps, mademoiselle, our separate journeys are not so separate after all." As the train gathered speed, carrying us through the English countryside toward whatever awaited at High Gables, Claire began to speak. Her story unfolded like a flower blooming in reverse, each revelation peeling back layers of family secrets, old grievances, and carefully maintained lies. 10 years ago, she had been a 12-year-old girl living at High Gables with her mother, Margaret, and her stepfather, Sir Alistair Renfrew. The household had been a complex web of relationships. Sir Alistair's daughter, Julia, from his first marriage, who had never accepted Margaret's place in the family. Captain Miles Davenham, a distant cousin who served as Sir Alistair's companion, and various other relatives and dependents who formed the closed circle of country house society. On the night of the midsummer garden party, Claire had witnessed what she believed to be her mother's murder, a deliberate push from the stone terrace that sent Margaret plummeting to her death on the rocks below. But when she tried to tell the adults what she had seen, she was dismissed as a traumatized child whose imagination had been overwrought by tragedy. "They sent me away the very next morning," Claire continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "Uncle Henry took me to London, then to Switzerland for my health. I was never allowed to return to High Gables, never permitted to speak of what I had seen. For 10 years, they convinced me I had been mistaken, that grief had distorted my memory. And now?" Poirot inquired gently. "Now I know I was right." She reached into her handbag and withdrew a telegram. "This arrived yesterday morning." Poirot read the message. Aloud, "Claire, time has come for truth to be told. Return to High Gables immediately. I know who killed your mother. Your life may be in danger, as mine is. Trust no one. Come alone, Uncle Alistair." The detective's eyebrows rose fractionally. "Most intriguing. And yet, mademoiselle, you do not come alone." "I couldn't," she admitted. "When I saw you on the train, when I learned you were also going to High Gables. It seemed like Providence. I've been afraid for so long, Mr. Poirot, afraid of what I might find, afraid of what they might do to keep their secrets buried." Poirot leaned forward, his manner becoming intensely serious. "Tell me, mademoiselle, in your memory of that night 10 years ago, the person who pushed your mother, did you see their face?" Claire closed her eyes, as though summoning the painful scene from the depths of her memory. "Not clearly. It was dark, and they stood in shadow. But I remember the silhouette, the way they moved. And I remember something else, something I've never told anyone." "Oui." "After my mother fell, before the screaming started, before everyone came running, the person who pushed her stood there for a moment, looking down. And then they laughed. It was soft, almost inaudible. But I heard it, a sound of satisfaction, of triumph. It was the laugh of someone who had gotten exactly what they wanted." The train began to slow as we approached our destination. Through the window, the lights of the village appeared like scattered diamonds against the dark countryside. In the distance, I could make out the imposing silhouette of High Gables itself, its windows glowing warmly against the night sky. Poirot gathered his belongings with characteristic precision. "Well then, Mademoiselle Claire," he said, his voice carrying a note of anticipation that I knew well. "It appears that the past has indeed come home to roost, and Hercule Poirot, he will be there to ensure that this time the truth will not be buried with the lies." As we prepared to disembark, I could not shake the feeling that we were not merely arriving at a country house for a consultation, but stepping onto a stage where a drama 10 years in the making was finally ready for its denouement. The girl who had refused to go home was returning at last, and with her came the reckoning that had been postponed for far too long. The train shuddered to a halt, and our investigation into the affair at High Gables was about to begin. The motor car that awaited us at the station bore the Renfrew coat of arms, though its elderly driver possessed the solemn demeanor of one accustomed to family crises. The 15-minute journey to High Gables took us through winding country lanes, where bare hedgerows loomed like sentinels against the mist-shrouded fields. Claire sat rigid beside me, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, while Poirot maintained his characteristic composure, his keen eyes cataloguing every detail of the landscape as though memorizing evidence for future reference. High gables emerged from the darkness like something from a Gothic romance, a sprawling manor house with twisted chimneys and mullioned windows that seemed to watch our approach with ancient, knowing eyes. The building had clearly been added to over the centuries, creating a maze of wings and courtyards that spoke of generations who had left their architectural mark upon the family seat. As our carriage drew up to the main entrance, the heavy oak door swung open to reveal a butler of the old school, who thin, elderly, and severe of countenance. His presence gave me the curious sense of stepping back 20 years in time. "Mr. Hercule Poirot?" he inquired with practiced deference. "At your service," Poirot replied with a slight bow. "Sir Alistair is expecting you, sir. Miss Clare—" He hesitated fractionally before pronouncing her name, his weathered face softening almost imperceptibly. "We have all been expecting you for some years." Before Claire could respond, a woman appeared in the doorway behind the butler. She was perhaps 45, her dark hair pulled severely back, her evening dress impeccably tailored. Her beauty was undeniable, though it carried a brittle quality that suggested years of carefully maintained facades. "Good heavens," she breathed, her composure slipping momentarily as her eyes fell upon Claire. "It really is you." Claire stepped forward with newfound determination. "Hello, Julia. You look well." Julia Renfrew, for this was clearly Sir Alistair's daughter, recovered her poise with admirable swiftness. "Father didn't mention you were coming," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "He's been rather preoccupied lately, quite unlike himself." "Indeed." Poirot's voice remained politely interested, though I caught the sharp glance he directed toward Julia. His letter seemed most lucid in its concerns. "Father has always been articulate, even in his more fanciful moments," Julia replied smoothly. "But come, you must be tired. I'll show you to your rooms." We crossed a wide, polished hall hung with family portraits, Renfrews in wigs and uniforms, stern ladies in satin and lace. From a distant room came the faint sound of a wireless playing dance music, while a grandfather clock ticked with solemn importance. A figure emerged from the shadows near the great staircase, a man of perhaps 50 with the bearing of a military officer and the weathered complexion of one who had spent considerable time in foreign climes. His pale blue eyes took in our party with obvious interest. "Miles Davenham," he introduced himself with a slight bow. "Alistair's cousin and companion. You must be the famous Hercule Poirot." His gaze shifted to Claire, and I saw something flicker in his expression. Surprise, certainly, but something else as well. "And Miss Clare? My word, how you've grown." Claire's response was cool. "Captain Davenham, I trust you've been well?" "Well enough," he replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Though I must say, your timing is rather unfortunate. Alistair has been troubled lately by old memories, old guilts." Before anyone could respond, footsteps echoed from the corridor beyond, and Sir Alistair Renfrew himself appeared. He was a tall man, grown somewhat shrunken, his once dark hair now iron-grey. Yet something formidable remained in the angle of his jaw and the keen, bloodshot eyes that darted toward us. "Poirot!" he exclaimed, his voice a gravelly rumble that barely disguised underlying desperation. "Thank God you've come." His gaze fell upon Claire, and his expression softened, though unease flickered across his features. "Claire, my dear child, you received my telegram." She went to him quickly. "Uncle Alistair, you said it was time for the truth." His hand trembled as it touched her hair. "Indeed, though I pray we are not too late." He looked up at Poirot with haunted eyes. "The past has been stirring, monsieur, and I fear it means to claim more victims before it rests." Poirot stepped forward, his manner becoming intensely serious. "Then we must ensure, Sir Alistair, that this time the truth will not be buried with the lies. The silence that followed was pregnant with tension, heavy with secrets that had festered for 10 long years. The stage was set, the players assembled, and Hercule Poirot's investigation was about to begin in earnest. Sir Alistair led us through corridors lined with ancestral portraits, their painted eyes seeming to follow our progress through the labyrinthine passages of high gables. The house possessed that peculiar atmosphere of old English country seats, a mixture of faded grandeur and comfortable shabbiness that spoke of generations who had left their mark upon both architecture and family history. Poirot's keen eyes missed nothing as we walked. He paused to straighten a slightly askew hunting print, adjusted a small ornamental clock by precisely half an inch, and ran his gloved finger along a marble bust, noting the faint accumulation of dust. These were not mere affectations, but extensions of his methodical mind, a physical manifestation of his need for order in all things. "Voila," he murmured to me quietly. "A house that has forgotten its rhythm, Hastings. When the domestic order is disturbed, it often reflects deeper disturbances within." We entered Sir Alistair's private study, a masculine sanctuary lined with leather-bound volumes and hunting trophies. The room bore the comfortable patina of a gentleman's retreat, though I noticed Poirot's attention immediately drawn to a silver-framed photograph on the desk. A beautiful woman with Claire's fair colouring and gentle smile. "Margaret," Sir Alistair said softly, following Poirot's gaze. "My dear wife. Claire's mother." His voice carried the weight of 10 years' accumulated guilt and sorrow. Claire moved to stand beside the desk, her fingers hovering over the photograph with reverent care. "Tell me what really happened that night, Uncle Alistair. Tell me why you've waited 10 years to acknowledge what I witnessed." Before Sir Alistair could respond, a knock interrupted our conference. The door opened to admit a young man of perhaps 28, tall and athletic, with dark hair and intelligent grey eyes that held a mixture of curiosity and barely concealed amusement. "Father, I heard we had distinguished guests," he said, extending his hand first to Poirot, then to me. "Anthony Renfrew. I've been away at Cambridge, but your telegram brought me home rather urgently." "My son," Sir Alistair explained, though his tone suggested some complicated history between them. "Anthony has been completing his studies in modern history, rather appropriate, given our current circumstances." Anthony's gaze settled on Claire with genuine interest. "So you're the famous Cousin Claire, the tragic child of family legend." His smile was disarming, though I detected shrewd intelligence behind the casual manner. "I was away at school when the great catastrophe occurred, but I've heard the whispered stories." "Anthony," Sir Alistair's voice carried a warning note. "This is hardly the time for your observations." "On the contrary, Father. When you summon Hercule Poirot to investigate family ghosts, I should say it's precisely the time for careful observation." He turned to Poirot with respectful attention. "I understand you're here to unravel our mysteries, monsieur." Poirot settled himself in a wing-backed chair, his manner patient yet intensely alert. "I am here, young man, because your father has expressed certain concerns. Perhaps, Sir Alistair, you would explain what has prompted this sudden urgency after 10 years of silence." Sir Alistair poured himself a generous measure of whiskey with hands that trembled slightly. "Because I've been a coward, Monsieur Poirot. Because I convinced myself that Margaret's death was an accident, despite what Claire claimed to have witnessed. But recent events have forced me to confront the truth." "Recent events?" Poirot's eyebrows rose with interest. 3 weeks ago, I began receiving anonymous letters. Vile, threatening things that dredged up details about that night. Details only someone who was present could have known. Sir Alistair's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. And then there were the incidents. Small things at first. A valuable snuff box disappeared from this very room. 2 nights ago, someone tampered with the brakes on my motor car. Claire's face paled. "Someone here knows the truth about Mother's death." "More than that," Sir Alistair replied grimly. Someone here committed murder 10 years ago, and they're prepared to kill again to keep their secret buried. Anthony's casual demeanor evaporated entirely. Good God, Father. You're saying Mother was actually murdered, that it wasn't an accident. I'm saying, Sir Alistair replied, his eyes moving around the room as though expecting to see the killer lurking in the shadows, that Hercule Poirot is our last hope of preventing another tragedy. Because whoever killed Margaret knows that Claire has returned, knows that I've been asking questions, and they won't hesitate to silence us both. Poirot leaned forward, his grey cells clearly already at work. Then we must proceed with the utmost care and method, Sir Alistair. For if a killer walks among us, they are surely watching our every move, listening to our every word. The game, as they say, is afoot. The weight of this revelation settled upon the room like a shroud, and I realized that our investigation had taken on a new and deadly urgency. The morning sun, streaming through the mullioned windows of high gables, cast long shadows across the breakfast room, where Poirot sat with characteristic precision, his coffee cup positioned at the exact angle that pleased his sense of order. I found him studying a leather-bound notebook, his grey cells clearly already engaged with the complexities of our case. "Ah, Hastings," he greeted me without looking up. "I've been considering the mathematics of murder. 10 years ago, we had a closed circle of suspects gathered for a midsummer celebration. Today, that same circle remains largely intact, with certain additions and subtractions that may prove most significant." Before I could respond, Julia Renfrew entered with the controlled grace of a woman accustomed to managing difficult situations. Her morning dress was impeccably chosen, though I detected something brittle beneath her composed exterior. "Good morning, gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying the well-modulated tones of her class. "I trust the rather dramatic circumstances of last evening didn't disturb your rest too greatly." Poirot rose with courtly precision. "Indeed, Mademoiselle Julia, though I confess, when mysteries present themselves, the mind of Hercule Poirot does not rest easily. Perhaps you would be so kind as to share your recollections of that tragic evening 10 years past." Julia's carefully maintained composure wavered slightly. "Surely Father has provided all necessary details. I find it rather painful to revisit such memories." "Mais non." Poirot's tone remained gentle yet insistent. "Each person sees events through their own particular lens. What seems unimportant to one becomes crucial evidence to another. You were present at the garden party, were you not?" "Of course. The entire household was there, along with perhaps 30 guests from the surrounding county." Julia seated herself with deliberate care. "It was Father's traditional midsummer night celebration. Margaret had been unwell for several weeks prior. Nervous strain, the doctor said." "And your relationship with your stepmother?" Poirot inquired delicately. "We were civil," Julia replied, though a faint edge crept into her voice. "She was Father's wife, and I accepted that. But she was not my mother." At that moment, Claire appeared in the doorway, her fair hair caught back severely, her blue eyes bright with newfound determination. She had clearly been listening, and her manner suggested she would no longer allow others to speak for her. "Civil?" Claire's voice carried a new edge of steel. "How thoughtful of you to put it so diplomatically, Julia. Perhaps you'd also like to explain to Monsieur Poirot why you argued with my mother just hours before her death." The silence that followed was electric. Julia's composure cracked visibly, her coffee cup rattling against its saucer. "I don't know what you mean," Julia said finally, though her voice lacked conviction. "I was 12, not deaf," Claire continued relentlessly. "I heard you in the rose garden that afternoon. You told Mother she didn't belong at High Gables, that she was nothing but a fortune-hunting widow who had bewitched your father. You said she would never truly be mistress of this house." Poirot leaned forward with sharp interest. "Most illuminating, Mademoiselle Claire. And how did your mother respond to these accusations?" "She said she was sorry Julia felt that way, but that she loved Uncle Alistair and intended to make him happy for as long as she lived." Claire's voice softened slightly. Mother was always trying to make peace, always hoping Julia would accept her. Julia's mask slipped entirely. Accept her? She was a nobody from nowhere who married my father for his money and position. She had no right to take my mother's place, to spend the family fortune on her ridiculous entertainments and charitable causes. Ah, Poirot interrupted gently. But now we begin to see the true landscape of that fatal evening. The human heart, it is complex geography indeed, love and hatred, jealousy and resentment existing side by side, and in such terrain, murder finds fertile ground. Julia realized her mistake immediately, her face paling. I didn't mean, that is, I would never. Of course not, mademoiselle, Poirot replied smoothly. But you see how the emotions, they reveal themselves when pressed. This is why Hercule Poirot must speak with each member of this household individually. For the truth, it hides in the spaces between what people say and what they feel. As Julia excused herself with obvious distress, Poirot turned to me with satisfaction. And so begins our methodical excavation of the past, mon ami. Each interview will reveal another layer, another motive, another secret carefully buried for 10 long years. Captain Miles Davenham entered the study with the measured precision of a career military man, though I detected beneath his composed exterior the wariness of one who understood that this interview would probe deeper than mere courtesy required. His pale blue eyes held that particular alertness I had observed in men who had faced both battlefield dangers and more intimate perils. Poirot gestured to the chair opposite his desk with characteristic courtesy. Captain Davenham, I understand you have been Sir Alister's companion for many years. Perhaps you would be so kind as to explain the nature of your relationship with this household. Davenham settled himself with practiced ease, his hands resting calmly on the chair arms. 15 years, all told. Alister and I served together in Afghanistan. He saved my life at Maiwand. When I returned from India, with my health somewhat compromised, he offered me a position here as companion and estate advisor. I've been grateful for his generosity ever since. And your position during Lady Margaret's residence as mistress of High Gables? A shadow crossed Davenham's weathered features, subtle but unmistakable to Poirot's keen observation. Margaret brought warmth to this house that had been absent since Alister's first wife died. She was exceptionally kind to everyone, regardless of their station. Poirot leaned forward slightly, his grey cells clearly engaged. Including yourself, Captain. The question carried particular weight, and I saw Davenham's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. Margaret treated me with courtesy and genuine friendship. She was a woman who possessed the rare gift of making others feel valued. Yet I am told, Poirot continued with deceptive mildness, that you were often seen in her company, more frequently perhaps than circumstances might typically warrant. Davenham's composure wavered slightly. Alister had his business responsibilities, his correspondence, his estate matters. I had fewer pressing obligations. Margaret was often alone, and she appreciated companionship, someone to discuss literature with, to walk in the gardens, to listen when she felt overwhelmed by the complexities of managing such a household. She confided in you then. She did. Davenham's voice grew softer, more reflective. Margaret was a woman who needed to feel truly loved, genuinely valued. The atmosphere in this house had grown strained in the months before her death. Julia's hostility was becoming more pronounced, and young Anthony's return from school that week had added additional tension. Poirot made a precise note in his leather journal. And on the evening of her death, Captain, what was your last interaction with Lady Margaret? Davenham paused, choosing his words with evident care. She approached me on the terrace during the party. She seemed distressed, uncertain about something. She asked if I truly believed Alister loved her, or if he had married her merely for companionship in his declining years. A most intimate confidence, Poirot observed. And your response? I assured her of Alister's devotion, naturally. But she seemed unconvinced. She mentioned that Julia had been making pointed comments about her background, her motives for marrying into the family. Margaret was beginning to doubt her place here. And after this conversation, she thanked me and said she needed to speak with Alistair privately. She seemed to have reached some sort of decision. Davenham's expression grew troubled. It was the last time I saw her alive. You did not witness her fall? I was in the billiard room with the vicar and Colonel Anstruther. We heard the screaming from the garden and rushed out with everyone else. His hands clenched involuntarily. She was lying on the rocks below the terrace. It was horrific. At that moment, Claire appeared in the doorway, her expression urgent. Monsieur Poirot, I've remembered something else about that night. Something important. Poirot gestured for her to continue, while Davenham shifted uncomfortably in his chair. After Mother fell, when everyone was rushing about in confusion, I saw someone near the Chinese lanterns. They were adjusting something on their wrist. Removing a bracelet, I think. It caught the light for just a moment before they slipped it into their pocket. A bracelet. Poirot's eyebrows rose with sharp interest. Gold, with small red stones. The same one I saw flash when Mother was pushed. Claire's voice grew stronger with conviction. Someone was hiding the evidence, even as everyone else was discovering the body. Davenham's face had grown pale during this recitation. I'm afraid I don't understand the significance. Ah, but I think you do, Captain, Poirot interrupted gently. For the truth, it has a way of surfacing, no matter how carefully it has been buried. The weight of Claire's revelation about the bracelet hung in the study's silence like incense, heavy and significant. Poirot remained perfectly still for several moments, his grey eyes fixed upon some invisible point in the middle distance where his extraordinary mind was already weaving connections between this new thread and the complex tapestry of motives that had begun to emerge. Très intéressant, he murmured finally, rising from his chair with characteristic precision. A bracelet of gold with red stones glimpsed in the moment of concealment. The human mind, Mademoiselle Claire. It records far more than we realize in moments of great shock. These fragments, they are often the keys that unlock the entire mystery. Captain Davenham's hasty departure had not escaped Poirot's notice, and I saw him make a small notation in his leather journal before turning his attention back to Claire. Now, ma petite, we must speak with each member of this household methodically. For if someone indeed hid evidence that night, they will be most anxious to learn what you remember. Our next interview was with Anthony Renfrew, whom we discovered in the morning room, arranging flowers with the sort of casual elegance that suggested both good breeding and genuine aesthetic sense. His greeting was warm, though I detected beneath his easy charm the particular alertness of an intelligent man who understood that this conversation would probe deeper than social pleasantries. Monsieur Poirot, he said, setting aside a spray of winter jasmine, I trust your investigation is proceeding satisfactorily. Though I confess, the atmosphere in this house has grown rather charged since your arrival. Poirot settled himself with his customary attention to detail, ensuring his chair was positioned at precisely the correct angle. Indeed, Monsieur Anthony, truth has a way of disturbing the peace, particularly when it has been buried for many years. Perhaps you would share your recollections of the evening your stepmother died. Anthony's expression grew more serious, though his manner remained composed. I was 18 then, fresh home from Cambridge for the summer holidays. The midsummer party was Father's annual tradition, quite elaborate, with Chinese lanterns strung throughout the gardens and a small orchestra on the south lawn. And your interactions with Lady Margaret that evening? I saw her several times during the party. She seemed rather agitated, more so than usual. I remember thinking she appeared to be searching for someone, or perhaps avoiding someone. Anthony paused, his intelligent eyes studying Poirot's face. There was one incident that struck me as particularly odd, though I didn't think much of it at the time. Poirot leaned forward with sharp attention. Continue, if you please. Earlier that evening, perhaps an hour before the tragedy, I was passing Father's study when I heard raised voices. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see Father and Margaret inside. He was speaking to her in tones I'd never heard him use before, harsh, almost accusatory. "Could you discern the nature of this disagreement?" Anthony's brow furrowed with the effort of recollection. "Not entirely, but certain phrases were quite clear. Father accused her of keeping secrets, of some form of betrayal that he called unforgivable. Margaret was defending herself, saying she had only tried to protect everyone, but Father seemed unconvinced. "Most illuminating," Poirot murmured, making precise notes. "And Lady Margaret's response?" "She became quite distressed. I heard her say something about the truth being more complicated than it appeared, and that she had never meant for anyone to be hurt." Father's voice dropped then, but his final words were clear enough. "If you persist in this deception, Margaret, you will force my hand." The implications of this revelation settled upon the room like a shroud. Poirot's expression remained carefully neutral, though I could see his mind working rapidly through the ramifications. "After this confrontation, did you observe any change in Lady Margaret's behavior?" "Indeed. She seemed almost desperate to speak privately with various members of the household. I saw her approach Captain Davenham with obvious urgency, and later she had what appeared to be a heated exchange with Julia near the terrace." "And your own whereabouts at the time of the tragedy?" Anthony's cheeks colored slightly. "I was in the summer house with Miss Eleanor Finch, the vicar's daughter. Hardly the most noble of alibis, but there it is. We heard the screaming and rushed out with everyone else." Poirot rose, indicating that the formal interview was concluded, but his manner suggested the conversation was far from over. "One final question, Monsieur Anthony. In your observation of the household these past days, since Mademoiselle Claire's return, have you noticed any particular anxiety among the family members?" Anthony considered this carefully. "Captain Davenham has been unusually withdrawn, spending long hours in correspondence. Julia has been irritable, more so than her customary sharpness would account for. And Father has been like a man awaiting judgment." As we prepared to leave, Anthony added quietly, "Monsieur Poirot, if someone in this house did indeed murder Margaret, they have lived with that secret for 10 years. Such a burden must have marked them in ways that careful observation might detect." "Précisément," Poirot replied, "and now that the past has been disturbed, that carefully maintained composure will begin to crack. The guilty party, they will make mistakes born of desperation." As we walked through the corridors toward the terrace, Poirot's manner became increasingly thoughtful. "So, Hastings, we now have a most complex picture emerging. A heated argument between husband and wife about secrets and betrayal, a bracelet hidden in haste, and a household where everyone harbors suspicions about everyone else. The psychological pressure, it builds like steam in a kettle." We stepped onto the stone terrace where Margaret Renfrew had met her death, and Poirot stood perfectly still, his eyes measuring distances and angles with the precision of a surveyor. The drop to the rocks below was indeed significant, and the positioning of the balustrade made accidental, death seem increasingly unlikely. "Here," he said softly. "Someone made a choice that changed everything. But they did not account for the eyes of a 12-year-old child, or for the passage of time that would eventually bring that child home to seek justice." As we turned to go back inside, I noticed a figure watching us from an upstairs window, a silhouette that withdrew quickly when observed. Poirot had seen it too, and his slight smile suggested that the psychological game he had spoken of was now well and truly begun. "The bracelet, Hastings," he murmured as we entered the house. "That is the thread we must follow most carefully. For somewhere in this house, hidden for 10 long years, lies the evidence that will expose a murderer." The discovery came quite by accident, as such revelations often do in the methodical pursuit of truth. Poirot had requested permission to examine Lady Margaret's former rooms, which Sir Alister had kept unchanged since her death, a shrine to grief and guilt that spoke volumes about the widower's state of mind. We found ourselves in an elegant suite overlooking the rose garden, where dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight streaming through tall windows. Margaret's personal effects remained precisely as she had left them. Silver brushes on the dressing table, books marked with silk ribbons, a half-finished piece of embroidery still stretched in its frame. Poirot moved through the space with reverent care, his keen eyes cataloguing every detail with the precision of an archaeologist examining sacred artifacts. He paused before the jewelry box, a mahogany creation inlaid with mother-of-pearl, and lifted the lid with delicate fingers. "Voilà," he murmured, studying the velvet-lined compartments. "The jewelry of a lady who possessed excellent taste but modest means before her marriage to Sir Alistair. See here, Hastings. The pieces are beautiful but not ostentatious." His attention focused immediately on one particular compartment, empty save for the faint impression left by something that had rested there for years. "Tiens," he said softly, his finger tracing the velvet depression. "Something is missing, something worn frequently enough to leave its mark upon the fabric." At that moment, Claire appeared in the doorway, her face pale with emotion at seeing her mother's preserved sanctuary. "I haven't been in here since that terrible night," she whispered, moving slowly toward the dressing table. "Mademoiselle," Poirot said gently, "you knew your mother's jewelry well. Can you tell me what piece might have rested in this empty compartment?" Claire approached the jewelry box with trembling hands, her eyes immediately focusing on the vacant space. "Mother's ruby bracelet," she said without hesitation. "It was her most treasured piece, a gift from her first husband, my father. She wore it constantly, said it brought her comfort." "Describe it, if you please." "Gold filigree work with small ruby cabochons. Very delicate, very distinctive. She was wearing it the night of the party. I remember seeing it catch the light from the Chinese lanterns." Claire's voice grew stronger with conviction. "It's the same bracelet I saw being hidden after she fell." Poirot made precise notes in his journal, his expression intensely focused. "And this bracelet, it was valuable." "Sentimentally, yes. Mother would never have removed it willingly. It never left her wrist except when she slept." A soft knock interrupted our conference, and Julia Renfrew entered with obvious reluctance. Her manner suggested she had been summoned rather than coming voluntarily, and her eyes avoided the jewelry box entirely. "Father asked me to see if you required anything," she said stiffly. Poirot turned to her with courteous attention. "Indeed, Mademoiselle Julia, perhaps you recall Lady Margaret's ruby bracelet. It appears to be missing from her collection." The effect was immediate and dramatic. Julia's carefully maintained composure cracked visibly, her face draining of color as her hands trembled slightly. I'm sure I don't know what happened to Mother's jewelry," she stammered, the slip in her choice of words not escaping Poirot's notice. "Ah," Poirot observed gently. "But you called her Mother just then, mademoiselle. Most interesting, considering your earlier assertions about never accepting her in that role." Julia's recovery was swift but incomplete. "A slip of the tongue. I meant Margaret, naturally. Tell me, when did you last see this particular bracelet?" "I really couldn't say. I didn't make a habit of cataloguing Margaret's jewelry." Julia's voice carried a defensive edge that seemed to confirm Poirot's suspicions. "Yet you are familiar with the piece?" Julia hesitated fractionally too long. It was rather distinctive. One noticed it. At that moment, Anthony appeared in the doorway, his expression troubled. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but someone has been in Father's study. Papers scattered, drawers opened. Nothing appears missing, but someone was clearly searching for something specific." The implications settled upon our group with ominous weight. Poirot's manner became immediately alert. "Most illuminating," he murmured, closing the jewelry box with deliberate care. "It appears our investigation has prompted someone to take desperate measures." As we prepared to examine the study, Julia lingered with obvious reluctance to leave. Her behavior had not escaped Claire's notice. "Julia," Claire said quietly, "you know what happened to Mother's bracelet, don't you?" The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Julia's response was to flee without another word, leaving us with the unmistakable impression that the psychological pressure Poirot had predicted was beginning to produce results. "The bracelet, Hastings," Poirot said as we descended toward the study. "It is indeed the key to everything. Someone has kept it hidden for 10 years, but now they fear discovery. The question becomes, will desperation drive them to make the fatal mistake that exposes their guilt?" Sir Alister's study presented a scene of methodical violation rather than chaotic destruction. Books had been removed from their shelves and replaced with careless haste, their leather spines no longer aligned in the precise order that had clearly once satisfied some fastidious mind. Papers lay scattered across the mahogany desk, though nothing appeared to have been stolen. A detail that immediately captured Poirot's attention. "Observe, Hastings," he murmured, kneeling beside the overturned chair. "This searcher possessed intimate knowledge of this room. See how they avoided the valuable silver inkwell, the collection of rare manuscripts? None. They sought something specific, something they believed Sir Alister had concealed." Sir Alister himself stood in the doorway, his face drained of color as he surveyed the violation of his private sanctuary. His hands trembled as he moved toward his desk, drawn by some terrible compulsion. "The dispatch box," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. They forced the lock. Indeed, the small mahogany box bore fresh scratches around its brass keyhole, and its contents lay exposed: business correspondence, legal documents, and what appeared to be several sheets of paper covered in an agitated, unfamiliar hand. Poirot approached with characteristic precision, his keen eyes cataloguing every detail. "These papers, Sir Alister, they were not here yesterday when we spoke." "No," Sir Alister replied, unconsciously adopting Poirot's French negative. "Someone has left these deliberately. They're meant for me to find." The papers proved to be copies of correspondence, letters that bore Margaret's elegant handwriting, addressed to various members of the household in the weeks before her death. Poirot read them with growing interest, his grey cells clearly engaged by their contents. "Most illuminating," he observed. Lady Margaret had been making inquiries about certain financial discrepancies in the household accounts. She had discovered someone had been systematically appropriating funds over several years. Claire stepped forward, her face pale but determined. "Mother was investigating theft." "More than investigating, mademoiselle. According to these letters, she had gathered substantial evidence and intended to confront the guilty party privately before involving the authorities." Poirot's expression grew grave. "She was, in effect, signing her own death warrant." At that moment, Captain Davenham appeared in the doorway, his military bearing intact despite the strain etched across his weathered features. His eyes took in the ransacked study with professional assessment. "When did this happen?" he asked, though something in his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. "During the night, apparently," Sir Alister replied. "Miles, these letters suggest Margaret discovered financial impropriety within our household. Did she confide her suspicions to you?" Davenham's composure wavered visibly. "She asked certain questions about the estate accounts, yes. I told her such matters were complex, that apparent discrepancies often had innocent explanations. But she persisted in her inquiries. Margaret was thorough in all her endeavors." His voice carried a note of something that might have been regret. "She possessed a keen mind for details that others might overlook." Poirot moved to the fireplace, where he noticed something that had escaped the searcher's attention, a loose brick in the hearth that showed signs of recent disturbance. With careful fingers, he worked it free, revealing a small cavity behind. "Voilà," he said softly, withdrawing a small object wrapped in velvet cloth. The cloth fell away to reveal a fragment of gold filigree work, delicate and distinctive, with traces of what appeared to be dried blood along one edge. Claire gasped audibly. Part of Mother's bracelet. The clasp. Indeed, Poirot confirmed, hidden here by someone who understood its significance as evidence. The question becomes, who knew of this hiding place, and why did they leave it for us to discover now? Sir Alister sank heavily into his chair, suddenly looking every one of his years. I found it the morning after Margaret's death, caught in the ivy near the terrace balustrade. I should have given it to the coroner, but I couldn't bear the thought of prolonging the investigation, of subjecting the family to further scrutiny. And so you concealed evidence of murder, Poirot observed without judgment. But someone knew of your discovery, someone who has been watching and waiting for the right moment to use this knowledge. As we contemplated this revelation, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed in the corridor. The psychological pressure Poirot had orchestrated was clearly producing results, forcing long-buried secrets into the light. The bracelet fragment, the financial evidence, the methodical search, Poirot murmured to me quietly. Our murderer grows desperate, mon ami. They reveal themselves through their very attempts at concealment. Soon, very soon, the final truth will emerge. The game of cat and mouse that had begun with Claire's return was approaching its climax, and I sensed that the next revelation would prove decisive in exposing the killer who had walked freely among us for 10 long years. The drawing room at High Gables had been transformed into something resembling a courtroom, with Poirot positioned near the fireplace like a judge presiding over proceedings that had been 10 years in the making. The evening light filtering through tall windows cast long shadows across the assembled company, each member of the household occupying their chosen position with the careful deliberation of chess pieces awaiting the final moves of an elaborate game. Sir Alister sat heavily in his leather armchair, his weathered hands gripping the armrests with white-knuckled intensity. Julia had positioned herself on the settee with characteristic precision, though her usual composure showed hairline cracks that spoke of mounting pressure. Anthony lounged with studied casualness near the bookshelf, his intelligent eyes darting between the other occupants with barely concealed fascination. Captain Davenham stood at rigid attention beside the mantelpiece, his military bearing intact, despite the pallor that had settled over his features like morning frost. Claire had chosen a chair near the windows, where the fading daylight caught her fair hair and emphasized the determined set of her jaw. She possessed, I realized, the same quality of quiet resolve that had brought her back to High Gables after 10 years of exile, a strength that would not be deterred by fear or intimidation. Mesdames et messieurs, Poirot began, his voice carrying the particular authority that preceded his most significant revelations. We gather tonight to examine not merely the circumstances of a decade-old tragedy, but the psychology that made such a tragedy inevitable. For murder, it does not spring from a vacuum. It grows from the soil of human weakness, nurtured by desperation and watered with lies. He moved to the center of the room with characteristic precision, his gray eyes cataloging each face with the methodical attention of a scientist studying specimens. Lady Margaret's death was indeed murder, committed by someone who possessed not only the opportunity and means, but the desperate necessity that transforms ordinary weakness into deadly action. The killer struck not from sudden passion, but from calculated self-preservation, for Margaret had discovered something that would have destroyed them utterly. The silence that followed was charged with electricity, heavy with the weight of accusations not yet spoken but clearly implied. The evidence, it speaks with crystalline clarity to those who know how to interpret its language. Poirot continued. First, we have the systematic appropriation of household funds over several years. Modest amounts, carefully concealed, but adding to a substantial sum. Second, we have Lady Margaret's correspondence, which proves she had identified this theft and intended to confront the perpetrator. Third, we have the physical evidence of the ruby bracelet, damaged in the fatal struggle and partially concealed for 10 years. Sir Alistair's voice emerged as barely more than a whisper. "You're saying someone in this room killed Margaret to prevent exposure of their crimes?" "Précisément," Poirot confirmed. "But more than that, the killer possessed intimate knowledge of Lady Margaret's habits, her schedule, her vulnerabilities. They knew exactly when and how to strike for maximum effect with minimum risk of discovery." His attention moved methodically from face to face, like a lighthouse beam sweeping across treacherous waters. "Mademoiselle Julia, your resentment toward your stepmother was no secret. You viewed her as an interloper who had stolen your father's affections and your rightful position as mistress of High Gables. On the very day of her death, you accused her of being a fortune-hunting widow who had bewitched Sir Alistair." Julia's carefully maintained facade cracked visibly. "I admit I disliked her, but I would never resort to violence. Whatever my feelings, I am not a murderer." "Indeed?" Poirot's eyebrows rose fractionally. "Yet the financial records show that you had access to the household accounts through your role in managing domestic expenses. The missing funds could easily have been diverted through such channels." "That's preposterous." Julia's composure shattered entirely. "I had no need to steal from my own family." But perhaps the need was not financial but psychological, a way of punishing the woman who had displaced you, of reclaiming what you felt was rightfully yours. Before Julia could respond, Poirot's attention shifted to Captain Davenham with laser-like intensity. "Captain, you were Lady Margaret's closest confidant. She trusted you completely, shared her concerns about the household irregularities, sought your counsel about how to proceed. When she revealed her intention to expose the theft, you realized your comfortable position here was threatened." Davenham's military bearing remained intact, though something flickered behind his pale eyes. "Margaret was a dear friend who deserved better than the hostility she encountered in this house. I would have done anything to protect her happiness, including murder to prevent her from destroying herself through misguided accusations." Poirot's voice carried deadly quiet. The psychological pressure in the room had become almost tangible, like the atmospheric tension before a thunderstorm. Each suspect seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for the lightning strike that would illuminate the truth. "But there is one piece of evidence," Poirot continued, reaching into his waistcoat pocket, "that narrows our field of suspects considerably." He withdrew a small object wrapped in tissue paper, handling it with the reverence due to a sacred relic. "This morning, hidden behind a loose stone in the garden wall near the terrace, we discovered something that the killer believed was safely concealed forever." The tissue fell away to reveal the remainder of Margaret's ruby bracelet. Delicate gold filigree work with several small rubies still intact, but bearing unmistakable stains that had darkened with age. The rest of Lady Margaret's treasured bracelet, complete with traces of blood that will, I am certain, prove to match that of the victim. Hidden for 10 years by someone who could not bear to destroy it entirely, yet dared not keep it where it might be discovered. Claire gasped audibly, her hand flying to her throat. "You found it? After all these years?" "Oui, mademoiselle, and with it, the final proof that your mother was indeed murdered. But more significantly, this bracelet was hidden in a location known only to someone with intimate knowledge of High Gables' grounds, someone who had explored every corner of the estate, who knew every hiding place, every secret passage. The implications settled upon the room like a shroud, and I saw understanding dawn in several faces simultaneously. "The killer walks among us still," Poirot announced with quiet finality. "And tomorrow, when the psychological pressure has reached its breaking point, they will make the final mistake that exposes their guilt beyond all doubt." As the gathering began to disperse in tense silence, I noticed that one member of our company had grown deathly pale, their hands trembling with barely controlled terror. The net was closing, and Hercule Poirot's inexorable logic was about to claim its quarry. The final morning at High Gables dawned with an ominous stillness that seemed to press against the ancient windows like a living thing. Poirot had requested that all members of the household gather in the drawing-room at precisely 10 o'clock, and the assembled company bore the unmistakable tension of those who knew that secrets long buried were about to be exhumed. Sir Alister sat heavily in his customary chair, his weathered hands trembling slightly as they gripped the armrests. The events of recent days had aged him visibly, carving new lines of worry and guilt across his patrician features. Julia maintained her characteristic poise, though I detected a brittleness beneath her composed exterior that suggested her carefully constructed defenses were beginning to crack under the sustained pressure of Poirot's investigation. Anthony lounged with studied casualness near the bookshelf, his intelligent eyes darting between the other occupants with barely concealed fascination. Captain Davenham stood at rigid attention beside the mantelpiece, his military bearing intact, despite the pallor that had settled over his weathered features like morning frost. Claire had positioned herself near the tall windows, where the grey February light caught her fair hair and emphasized the determined set of her jaw, the same quiet resolve that had brought her back to High Gables after 10 years of enforced exile. Poirot stood before the fireplace with characteristic precision, his small stature commanding the room through sheer force of intellect and personality. His grey eyes moved methodically from face to face, cataloguing every expression, every gesture, every telltale sign of guilt or innocence with the practiced attention of a master craftsman examining his materials. "Mesdames and Messieurs," he began, his voice carrying the particular authority that preceded his most significant revelations. "We gather this morning to examine not merely the circumstances of a decade-old tragedy, but the psychology that made such a tragedy inevitable. For murder, it does not spring from a vacuum. It grows from the soil of human weakness, nurtured by desperation and watered with lies." He moved to the center of the room with deliberate steps, his presence filling the space despite his modest physical dimensions. Lady Margaret's death was indeed murder, committed by someone who possessed not only the opportunity and means, but the desperate necessity that transforms ordinary weakness into deadly action. The killer struck not from sudden passion, but from calculated self-preservation, for Margaret had discovered something that would have destroyed them utterly. The silence that followed was electric, charged with the weight of accusations not yet spoken but clearly implied. Each member of the assembled company seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the lightning strike that would illuminate the truth. "The evidence speaks with crystalline clarity to those who know how to interpret its language," Poirot continued, his tone becoming more intense. "First, we have the systematic appropriation of household funds over several years. Modest amounts, carefully concealed, but adding to a substantial sum that would have supported a comfortable lifestyle for someone with expensive tastes or pressing debts. Second, we have Lady Margaret's correspondence, which proves she had identified this theft and intended to confront the perpetrator privately before involving the authorities. Third, we have the physical evidence of the ruby bracelet, damaged in the fatal struggle and hidden for 10 years in a location known only to someone with intimate knowledge of High Gables grounds. His attention moved systematically through the room, like a lighthouse beam sweeping across treacherous waters. "Mademoiselle Julia, your resentment toward your stepmother was no secret, and your role in managing household expenses provided access to the accounts. Yet the financial records show a pattern of appropriation that began before Lady Margaret's arrival, ruling you out as the primary culprit, though your hostility certainly provided convenient misdirection." Julia's carefully maintained facade showed the first hairline cracks, though she remained silent. "Monsieur Anthony, your youth at the time of the murder and your absence at Cambridge during the critical period eliminate you from direct involvement, though your recent anonymous letters to your father showed a troubling willingness to manipulate family tragedy for your own purposes." Anthony's casual demeanor evaporated entirely, his face flushing with embarrassment and fear. "Which brings us," Poirot said, his voice dropping to a more intimate register, to the true architect of this tragedy. Captain Davenham, you have maintained throughout our investigation that you were Lady Margaret's trusted confidant, the friend who provided comfort during her difficulties with the household. But friendship, when it conceals betrayal, becomes the cruelest weapon of all. Davenham's military posture remained rigid, though something flickered behind his pale eyes, a recognition that his carefully constructed defenses were about to be systematically dismantled. You see, Captain, the financial records tell a most interesting story. The missing funds were not taken randomly, but followed a pattern that corresponds precisely with your gambling debts incurred during your military service in India. Debts that followed you to England, debts that required regular payments to maintain your reputation and position in this household. Poirot moved closer to Davenham, his grey cells clearly engaged in their final, devastating analysis. Lady Margaret discovered these irregularities during her review of the household accounts, but rather than expose you immediately, she did what her generous nature demanded. She approached you privately, offering you the opportunity to explain, perhaps even to make restitution without involving Sir Alister. Her kindness, Captain, sealed her fate. The psychological pressure in the room had become almost tangible, like the atmospheric tension before a thunderstorm. Davenham's composed exterior began to show signs of strain, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. On the evening of the midsummer party, Lady Margaret sought you out on the terrace. She had made her decision. She would give you one final chance to confess to Sir Alister voluntarily before she revealed your betrayal herself. But you, Captain, you saw only ruin and disgrace. The comfortable life you had built on your benefactor's generosity, the respect you had earned through years of faithful service, all of it would be destroyed by the revelation of your weakness. Claire stepped forward, her voice steady despite the emotion underlying her words. I remember now, Monsieur Poirot. Something I had buried so deeply that it only surfaced when I heard Captain Davenham speak again after all these years. All eyes turned to her as she continued with growing conviction. When Mother was pushed, when she cried out, the person who pushed her said something. Just 2 words, but I heard them clearly through the shock and terror. Forgive me. I was too young then to recognize the voice, but hearing Captain Davenham these past few days, the memory came flooding back. It was his voice I heard that night, speaking those words as my mother fell to her death. The revelation struck the room like a physical blow. Sir Alister stared at his old friend with horror and disbelief, while Davenham's carefully maintained composure finally began to crumble. Précisément, Mademoiselle Claire, Poirot confirmed. The human mind, especially that of a child in trauma, records far more than we realize. Those 2 words, forgive me, spoken not in malice but in the desperate anguish of a man who knew he was destroying everything he claimed to value. Poirot turned back to Davenham with relentless logic. The struggle on the terrace damaged Lady Margaret's treasured bracelet. In your panic, you attempted to remove all evidence of the confrontation, succeeding in tearing away part of the delicate gold work. But you could not retrieve the clasp that Sir Alister later discovered, and in your haste, you concealed the remainder in a hiding place you knew well from your years of exploring these grounds, the loose stone in the garden wall beneath your study window. The psychological burden of your crime has marked you, Captain. Your increased drinking, your withdrawal from social interaction, your obvious discomfort whenever Lady Margaret's death was discussed, all symptoms of a conscience that could not rest despite your attempts to bury the truth. Davenham's military bearing finally collapsed entirely. He sank into the nearest chair, his weathered face buried in his hands as the weight of 10 years' guilt overwhelmed his defenses. She was going to forgive me, he said in a broken whisper. Even after discovering my betrayal, she was prepared to help me make things right. She spoke of finding a way to repay the money without destroying my reputation, of giving me a chance to redeem myself, and I, God help me, I killed her for her kindness. The confession poured out in a torrent of anguish and self-recrimination. The gambling debts, the gradual escalation of theft, the growing desperation as Margaret's investigation closed in, all the sordid details of a man whose weaknesses had led him step by step toward the ultimate betrayal. "I never meant for her to die," Davenham continued, his voice raw with emotion. "I only wanted to silence her, to prevent her from speaking, but she struggled, and the balustrade was lower than I realized, and when she fell—" He looked up at Sir Alistair with haunted eyes. "I have lived with that moment every day for 10 years, Alistair. Every day." Sir Alistair's response was barely audible. "You were my friend, Miles. I trusted you with my life, with my family's welfare. How could you?" "Because I was weak," Davenham replied simply. "Because I chose the easy path of deception rather than the difficult path of truth. And because of that weakness, an innocent woman died." The local constabulary arrived within the hour, summoned by Poirot's earlier telegram. As they led Captain Davenham away, he walked with the dignity of a soldier facing his final battle, his confession having lifted the burden of secrecy, if not the weight of guilt. Claire stood at the window watching the police carriage disappear down the drive, her expression peaceful for the first time since our arrival at High Gables. The truth she had sought for 10 years had finally been revealed, bringing with it not joy, but a quiet satisfaction that justice had finally been served. "Will it help?" she asked Poirot quietly. "Knowing the truth?" "The truth, mademoiselle. It does not heal all wounds, but it prevents them from festering in darkness. Your mother's memory is no longer shadowed by the lie of accident. She died not because she was careless or unlucky, but because she was kind, and sometimes, tragically, kindness encounters evil." As we prepared to depart High Gables that afternoon, the ancient house seemed somehow lighter, as though the revelation of its long-held secret had lifted a weight from its very foundations. The February mist that had shrouded our arrival was clearing, allowing pale sunlight to illuminate the grounds where Margaret Renfrew had met her tragic end. "Another case concluded, Poirot," I observed as our carriage pulled away from the imposing facade. "Oui, Hastings, but not without cost. The price of truth is often higher than we anticipate when we begin seeking it." He adjusted his gloves with characteristic precision. "Yet seek it we must, for lies are like poison. They corrupt everything they touch until the truth provides the only antidote." As High Gables receded into the distance behind us, I reflected that, once again, Hercule Poirot's little grey cells had brought order out of chaos, light out of darkness, and justice out of a decade of carefully maintained deception. The girl who had refused to go home had finally found the truth she sought, and with it, perhaps, the peace that had eluded her for so many years. The silence that followed Captain Davenham's departure seemed to settle into the very stones of High Gables, heavy with the weight of revelation and the complex emotions that truth inevitably brings. Sir Alistair remained in his chair, staring at the empty doorway through which his oldest friend had been led away in handcuffs, the betrayal cutting deeper than any physical wound could have managed. Claire moved to stand beside him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. "Uncle Alistair, you mustn't blame yourself for trusting him. Mother wouldn't want that." 15 years, he whispered, his voice barely audible. 15 years I shared my home with Margaret's murderer, broke bread with him daily, confided my deepest concerns to the man who had killed my wife. Poirot approached with characteristic precision, his manner both gentle and authoritative. "Sir Alistair, the human heart, it seeks to see goodness even where corruption has taken root. Captain Davenham did not begin as a murderer. He became one through a series of small compromises, each seeming insignificant until they culminated in tragedy. Your trust was not misplaced initially, it was betrayed gradually." Julia entered the drawing room with obvious reluctance, her usual sharp composure replaced by something approaching humility. The revelation that her stepmother had died not from accident, but from deliberate murder, had shattered her carefully constructed narrative of justified resentment. "Claire," she said quietly, her voice carrying 10 years of accumulated guilt, "I owe you an apology. I made your mother feel unwelcome in what should have been her home. I let my loyalty to my own mother's memory blind me to Margaret's genuine kindness." Claire turned to face her stepsister, and I saw in her expression the same generosity of spirit that had characterized her mother. "Julia, we were both children dealing with loss in our own ways. Mother understood that your hostility came from pain, not malice." Anthony appeared in the doorway, his usual casual confidence replaced by genuine remorse. "Father, I need to confess something. Those threatening letters you received, they were my doing. I thought it would be intellectually interesting to see how you would react under pressure. I never imagined they would lead to this." Sir Alister's expression grew stern. "You played with forces you didn't understand, Anthony. Your games could have prevented the truth from emerging entirely." "I know that now," Anthony replied, his voice carrying authentic shame. "I've been treating our family's tragedy as material for intellectual exercise rather than recognizing the real pain it caused. I'm truly sorry." Poirot observed these exchanges with satisfaction, recognizing the first tentative steps toward genuine healing. "The truth, it does not always bring immediate comfort," he said, addressing the assembled family. "But it provides the foundation upon which authentic relationships can be rebuilt. For 10 years, this household has lived with the poison of secrets and lies. Now finally, that poison can be purged." As the afternoon light began to fade through the tall windows, preparations for our departure commenced. The psychological healing would take time, but the essential work had been accomplished. Truth had been revealed, justice served, and the innocent freed from the burden of doubt and guilt. Claire packed her modest belongings with quiet efficiency, her movements suggesting not flight but purposeful transition. She had found what she came seeking, not revenge, but vindication of her childhood memories and her mother's honor. "Monsieur Poirot," she said as we prepared to leave, "I cannot adequately express my gratitude. You've given me back my faith in my own perceptions, my own memory." "Ma petite," Poirot replied with gentle warmth, "you possessed the courage to seek truth when others preferred comfortable lies. That courage, it deserved to be rewarded with justice." As our carriage pulled away from High Gables for the final time, I reflected on the complex web of relationships that had made tragedy inevitable. Love and hatred, loyalty and betrayal, kindness and weakness, all had played their parts in the drama that culminated in Margaret Renfrew's death. "Another case concluded, Poirot," I observed. "Oui, Hastings, but with lessons that extend beyond the circumstances of this particular crime. The greatest tragedies often spring not from evil intentions, but from human weakness, the small compromises that accumulate until they demand terrible prices." Poirot adjusted his traveling coat with characteristic precision, his grey eyes already contemplative. Captain Davenham did not set out to become a murderer. He became one through choices that seemed insignificant at the time. That is perhaps the most sobering truth of all. We are all capable of both great kindness and terrible weakness. The difference lies not in our nature, but in our choices when faced with moral crisis. The girl who had refused to go home had finally found the truth she sought, and with it, the peace that had eluded her for 10 long years. The railway compartment that carried us away from High Gables seemed lighter somehow, as though the revelation of truth had lifted a weight that had pressed upon that ancient house for 10 long years. Claire sat across from us with an expression of quiet resolution, the desperate determination that had marked her arrival, replaced by something approaching serenity. The girl who had refused to go home had finally found what she sought, not revenge, but vindication and the possibility of genuine healing. Poirot arranged his traveling effects with characteristic precision, each item finding its appointed place in his carefully ordered world. His grey eyes held that particular gleam of satisfaction that followed the successful conclusion of a complex investigation, though I detected beneath it the melancholy that often accompanied cases where human weakness had led to tragedy. "Tell me, Mademoiselle Claire," he said as the English countryside rolled past our window, "now that you have found the truth you sought, what will you do with this knowledge?" Claire considered the question carefully, her blue eyes reflecting the afternoon light. "I think I shall finally allow myself to grieve properly for my mother. For 10 years, I've been consumed with anger and the need for vindication. Now I can simply remember her as she was, kind, generous, always trying to see the best in people even when they disappointed her." "And your immediate plans?" "I shall return to my teaching position in Switzerland, but with a lighter heart. Uncle Alistair has asked me to visit regularly, and I think I shall. High Gables needs healing, and perhaps I can be part of that process, rather than a reminder of its pain." Poirot nodded approvingly. "Wisdom beyond your years, ma petite. The desire for revenge, it consumes the soul like acid. But justice, true justice, it allows for healing and redemption." As the train gathered speed toward London, I found myself reflecting on the transformation we had witnessed. Sir Alistair, though deeply wounded by his friend's betrayal, had begun the difficult process of rebuilding relationships with his children. Julia, stripped of her convenient resentments, was tentatively learning to see Margaret as a human being rather than an interloper. Even Anthony, chastened by the consequences of his manipulative games, seemed genuinely committed to change. "What strikes me most, Poirot," I said, voicing my thoughts, "is how ordinary evil can appear. Davenham wasn't a monster. He was simply a weak man who made increasingly desperate choices." "Précisément, Hastings. Evil rarely announces itself with theatrical gestures. More often, it wears the face of respectability and justifies its actions with seemingly reasonable arguments. The human soul, it is a battlefield where conscience wars with self-interest. Most never face the ultimate test, but for those who do, their choices reveal their true character." Several weeks later, as London's familiar bustle had swept away the immediate intensity of our investigation, a letter arrived that provided the epilogue our story deserved. Poirot examined the familiar handwriting with interest before sharing Claire's news. She wrote of Uncle Alistair's gradual recovery from the shock of betrayal, of Julia's tentative steps toward genuine sisterhood, and of Anthony's return to Cambridge with newfound maturity. Most significantly, she described her decision to pursue teacher training, inspired, she said, by a desire to help children trust their own perceptions even when adults dismissed them. "You see, Hastings," Poirot observed, placing the letter beside a photograph Claire had enclosed, Margaret laughing in the garden with young Claire at her side, "this is why the work of Hercule Poirot extends beyond merely catching criminals. It is the restoration of balance, of truth in minds that have doubted themselves." The photograph now occupied a place of honor on our mantelpiece, a reminder that victims of crime are more than case studies. They are human beings who loved, laughed, and believed in the essential goodness of others. "The bracelet will serve as evidence in Captain Davenham's trial," Poirot continued, "but it represents something greater, the enduring power of memory to pierce through the darkest deceptions. Truth, Mademoiselle Claire discovered, is like a river. It may be diverted or forced underground, but eventually it always finds its way back to the surface." As evening settled over London, I reflected that once again, Hercule Poirot's little grey cells had brought order from chaos and light from darkness. The affair at High Gables was concluded, but its lessons would endure, reminding us that justice, however delayed, remains possible, and that the courage to seek truth, however painful, provides the only foundation upon which genuine healing can be built. "Come, Hastings," Poirot said, adjusting his waistcoat with characteristic precision. We will dine well tonight, and tomorrow the little grey cells will face new mysteries. For in this world of human complexity, there will always be truth waiting to be discovered.